And welcome back. So this time I had on a guy named Daniel Uebele, and we are going to talk about astronomy, existential risk, and other things that are creeping up on us with the growth of human technology, as well as the dangers that occur with that, and how we could be walking into either paradise or a disaster. And we'll go into length about that coming up. I do want to go ahead and point out some things that I noticed. For one, there were some problems with the audio, specifically my audio during this. So that's my bad. And it was not helped by the fact that I could not seem to shut my mouth at other points. So once again, my bad. And we will look at what we can do in the future to make sure there are less problems with the quality of the podcast. If you have any ideas about what we can do, those are always welcome. Currently, the way that we've been recording these has been through meetings through Zoom, for those of you who know what that is. If you have any other ideas about what we can use as a conduit for these calls and conversations, by all means share. For now, though, I think the biggest challenge, of course, is keeping a steady stream of interested guests for the show. So we're always looking to see if anyone will step up for that or have a name to suggest that seems to have some popularity with other members in the sub. And any other feedback is welcome. And we'll be looking to create a channel for this on YouTube fairly soon. Once again, I need to talk and discuss the finer details of that with the other mods, but we're getting there and we're making progress. I think that's everything for now, though, so with that, I'll give you Daniel Uebele. Okay, and we are here with Daniel Uebele, and he is here to talk to us today about astronomy, existential risk, and history, and how they all tie together into our current politics. But before we get into that, I'm going to let Daniel introduce himself and describe where he comes from and how he came to be part of this IDW community. So Daniel, why don't you take it from there?
Hey, yeah. I don't know how far back to go here, but my point of view has been different from most of the people I find myself surrounded with. I was working as a mechanical engineer for an aerospace company out near Seattle, Washington, a bit north of Seattle, actually, up in Everett. And I was raised a fundamentalist Christian, and after graduating college and finally having some time in my hands to sort of investigate the deep questions of my life, I was struck by really the poverty of my ideas to answer the big questions, that the world is continually presenting to us. I was flummoxed, at every turn. And it took me a while, but between one thing and another, I ran across the Joe Rogan podcast. And then it wasn't long before I found him interviewing this neuroscientist called Sam Harris. And they were talking about what's possible in this world, given what we know and what could happen, what's on the table for us in the future. And what Sam laid out was really a breathtaking view. I think he said something like, given sufficient knowledge, almost anything is possible, right? Unless we foreclose this experiment, unless we foreclose on ourselves, right? Unless we screw ourselves up, we can do anything. And okay, so a few months later, I'm driving home from my folks' place in Wisconsin. I'm taking the scenic route through the Grand Teton National Park. And I remember sort of in the back of my head that Sam had his own podcast, so I decided to give it a try. And so driving through the Grand Tetons there, I was listening over and over to this, I think it was the Waking Up podcast number 41, Faith and Reason with Eric Weinstein, who I had never heard of before. And those two guys just blew me away, the depth of their arguments, the careful way in which they disagreed with each other without trying to score cheap points, just digging deeper and deeper, trying to arrive at a mutual understanding of the truth. Man, I couldn't get enough of that. And so that was my introduction to the IDW, I suppose. That must have been back in, what do you think, Joe? 2014? Does that sound right? I don't know how closely you follow the Waking Up podcast.
It could have been. I'd say I've been following it since 2015. So that's definitely before it was the intellectual dark web was I guess truly consummated.
Yeah, it was before
But,
then.
but definitely, I mean, some key players are right there. Both Harris and Eric Weinstein. I mean, you know, it's similar for me in that I was a big follower of Sam Harris well before the intellectual dark web became a thing by many years. I mean, I was familiar with his work as far back as I guess you would say 2010, and so yeah, that's so. It seems like that some. I mean, it seems like a lot of people have become interested in the intellectual dark web after it became a thing within, let's say, the last year, and I guess we're some of the minority that's sort of always been sitting there waiting for it to come together. But that's it's an interesting thing. So what's your like educational background?
I have a humble bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, great. So I guess we can go ahead and get into what you want to discuss. You have you sort of want to look at things from an astronomical perspective. I guess I'd really be interested to know what exactly you mean by that. I mean, could you just, I guess, give us your starting thesis statement here?
Sure, right. I'm not qualified to give, probably even an introductory course in astronomy, but just to sort of bracket the problem of what we're interested about when we're looking out into the stars, I think most people have asked themselves the question, like, hey, do I think there are aliens out there? And it's an interesting question, isn't it? And most people, I'm guessing, sort of shrug their shoulders and think, well, how could we possibly know, right? SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, has famously been listening to the radio waves, the electromagnetic radiation from the cosmos for the last several decades and have come up empty, right? But also we know the only thing that tells us is that there are no civilizations out there producing sufficiently loud EM signals that we would pick up, right? And there are many reasons that could be the case. It doesn't preclude aliens existing. But what I was hoping to talk about with you was I wanted to put forward what is still a kind of controversial idea, which is an assertion that we do have this, like, the whole volume of space that we could conceivably reach. The universe is expanding, right?
Right.
So there's a certain distance we're not going to get past. We can see it now, but it's going to move away from us. The volume of space that we're actually interested in terms of we're going to be able to interact with it in the future, is not infinite. It's mostly the Milky Way, Andromeda, and the local group of smaller galaxies that surround us. And I believe we can be almost certain that we're going to have the whole space to ourselves. And that's a pretty heady concept, Like, thinking about it, you can get a bit carried away with what's possible. It's exciting, but it's...
And when you say to ourselves, you're talking about human species specifically.
And any animal species we choose to uplift, yes.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense, yeah.
Taking the big picture, right?
So we'll probably keep dogs around because we seem to like dogs.
Yeah, and no doubt once we get good enough at gene editing technology, if we aren't already, some wacko somewhere is going to make his dog smart, and then we're going to have to talk to them.
Right, okay, yeah. So
that's all coming down the pipeline eventually, right?
Right, yes, okay.
I wasn't going to talk about that today, but we could if you want to.
What we can get onto that I think if there's room, but I am more interested in before I interrupted. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think many listeners will know that what I've been referring to is something called the Fermi paradox. Are you familiar with that concept?
I've heard of it. I could not. I don't think I could define it for you if asked. So why don't you do that, and for the sake of any audience members who are in my position.
Sure. I'll try to do it in a way that people haven't heard before, if, a lot of people have heard it. So the guys, I'm going to get some of this wrong, but here's the basic story. So the guys who are working on the great physicists, they're working on the Manhattan Project, trying to make the first nuclear weapons in the world. And around their lunch table, these guys are interested in the universe. They're interested in astronomy. They're physicists. They know what's up. They can do math, and they often talk about aliens. And then one day, they've been doing some napkin math, and they know, all right, so our universe has been around for 14.6 billion years, right? And the elements required to support life have been around for most of that time, because those elements come from the heaviest stars, which blow up soonest in supernovae. So there's nothing to say that we're the first out there, right? And the galaxy is 100,000 light years across. So they assume, okay, let's say, once we figure out all this nuclear technology stuff, we could probably get a spaceship up to about 10% light speed. That's conservative. Maybe 5%, but it doesn't matter. Whether it's 1 million years or 10 million years, whether we're taking our time or racing ahead, we can colonize the whole Milky Way in an eye blink. If you're taking the long view of geologic time. If you're watching the galaxy, if you've got God's point of view, right, and you blink your eyes a few times, all of a sudden, boom, humanity's all over in the Milky Way, right? It could happen that fast from that point of view. So Fermi famously looked at everyone and he said, well, where is everyone, right? And he wasn't wondering, why don't we see UFOs flying around the sky and all that kind of stuff. What he was asking was, why don't we see aliens walking down Main Street, while they're taking a holiday? Because it's not just the case that, it might be difficult to do. It has to be the case that not one civilization has ever done it, ever, right, in all this time. Because if the success rate was only 1%, and you had 1,000 civilizations rising and falling, well, then 10 of those would have made it out through the bottleneck, colonized the whole place, right? And we'd see 10, species of aliens constantly popping in and out, but we see nothing. And the next thing I wanted to talk about, so that's the background for the Fermi paradox. It's just that simple math, right? And the next wrinkle to add here is something that makes the problem a little bit even more pessimistic for finding alien life. And that's this. It's something called the Dyson dilemma, which I'm guessing most people have not heard of. Have you, Joe, have you heard of the Dyson dilemma?
I haven't heard of it, so I'm interested to know what it is.
Have you heard of a Dyson sphere?
I haven't heard of that either.
Okay, so a Dyson sphere is a sci-fi concept. I think nowadays people tend more to talk about Dyson swarms, but it's an optimistic prediction for our future. It's actually a wonderful idea, right? And SpaceX is going to help us make this happen. I think the future's looking bright for us. So I'd like to paint a picture here, if I could.
Okay.
All right. So life requires energy, and life wants to grow. And as long as we're stuck here on this Earth, the maximum amount of energy that life can subsist on is defined by the cross-sectional area that the Earth, of the flux of solar radiation that the Earth absorbs from the sun, puts an upper limit on the energy that life on Earth can be running on. So as human civilization has been growing, we've pushed out the amount of biomass in other ecosystems. Like our farm animals now account, and us together account for most of the biomass on Earth. And that's an energy problem. But we're sitting here next to this perfect, enormous fusion reactor, which is spraying free, precious energy out into the void of space. And once it does that, it's unrecoverable. And all you have to do to catch it is to put out a simple solar panel. So the most obvious thing that we could do once we get out there, and it looks like, watching the industry progress, the plans that SpaceX and NASA are making, we are maybe 100 years out, something like that, give or take, from starting up large-scale space infrastructure. So we're talking about solar panels, automated solar panel factories. We could do farming in space, catching all that sunlight. We can make habitats out there. We can colonize other planets. There's a million ways this could go, but there's plenty of raw material out there. And as long as we have free energy and free raw materials, it's a no-brainer that as long as we can expand, we will expand. And it's going to be great. It's going to be an era of, Brett Weinstein talks a lot about this, right? That when you can't grow the pie in one way, you grow the pie in another way, right? So when the German population prior to World War II, things are getting tight, or prior to World War I, states start eyeing each other up, like, hey, maybe I can take your territory. Are you looking so tough? This is a vista of, like, this is a bonanza of expansion that could last for 10 million years, So I think we're going to do it if we can do it. And let's get back to the astronomy, though. That was just a quick aside. So let's say you and I are aliens on Tau Ceti. We've got telescopes like we've got telescopes now. We look at the skies and we're looking over at Sol, our star, the star that Earth orbits, and we notice as the years are passing that the visible light is getting a bit dimmer. And the spectrum is slowly shifting down into infrared. And the reason is because we're putting up endless amounts of solar panels, habitats, farms. We're expanding our living space. We're making a paradise over here. And from their point of view, our star is turning off. It's going dark. But they can still see it because they've got tools to see in infrared. Have you seen pictures of the International Space Station? They've got these big radiators out on either side.
I haven't seen those, no.
Okay, well, most people might think that those are solar panels because they're just about as big as the solar panels, but those things are radiating the heat of the space station out into space. Because if they didn't do that, the astronauts inside would cook. If you're using energy, you have to emit heat. It's one of the fundamental laws of thermodynamics, right? So any civilization that's using a significant percentage of its star's energy output is going to be glowing like a firefly in the night. It'll be unmistakable. It'll be obvious. You just look at a star, and if it's putting out an unusual amount of infrared radiation as opposed to visible radiation, which stars don't do, then boom, you know what's happening over there. There's a Dyson swarm in construction, right?
So that's why in science fiction movies, like the Predator movies, when they see humans, the predators see humans in infrared light, we appear to be glowing because what we've effectively done in the language of what sounds like the second law of thermodynamics you're describing is the visible light from the sun we have processed, and now we're emitting that energy as infrared light, yes?
Exactly. So the energy hits our solar panels, we use it, and then we emit it as heat, basically. And the more efficient we are, the lower temperature that heat will be when we emit it, but we're never going to be able to hide it completely. There's nothing more obvious that a civilization can do than construct a Dyson swarm. And there's also almost nothing that a civilization would want to do more than construct a Dyson swarm. So there's a couple caveats. Do you see where this argument is kind of going here? Why we're pretty sure there aren't any such civilizations out there?
Because if they would see us doing it, it is also true that we don't see anyone else doing it that is close enough to us.
Right. Now, we could miss one. That's possible. Like if it was on the other side of Sagittarius A, the black hole in the center of the galaxy, we could miss that. That's true. It's possible that we could miss one or two Dyson swarms out there. But if we just allow our imaginations to extend a little bit further out into the future, and I know this is where we're going to lose some people because it's difficult to do this, but let's say we've finally reached full saturation after a couple thousand years, an eye blink in galactic time. We've reached full saturation in our solar system. By that time, it's not going to be too hard to propel a spacecraft out to Alpha Centauri, right? Or wherever we think is a good spot. And very likely, long before that time comes, some kind of Daniel Boone type or Davy Crockett character is going to want to do it, because elbow room, right? Or just the sheer sense of adventure. If you've got hundreds of trillions of people, which those kinds of population levels aren't too difficult to reach, the human spirit of adventure is irrepressible, right? People are going to want to get out there. And it's going to be much easier to start a Dyson swarm around the second star than it was the first, right? Because now we've got all the blueprints. You take a thumb drive with you, you start up your automated factories, and you can live like a king until everyone else shows up. So really, the heart of the Dyson dilemma is something like this. When you go outside at night and you look up, the strangest thing is that we can see any stars at all. Because if there was anyone else out there like us, they would be gone, at least in the visible spectrum. The whole sky would glow in infrared for sure, right? The vast, you know, alien civilization out there would not be wasting that energy. You know, they need that energy. They want to use it for things. But they're not doing that. No one's doing that. It's sort of like, how do you know there's not a forest fire? You could be missing the start of a forest fire, right? But if you look out, you don't see any smoke, you don't see any flames, you're pretty sure you've got that forest is safe to walk into, you know? And we are assuming that a civilization like ours is going to spread relatively quickly. You know, maybe we can hit 2% light speed, maybe 20%, but we can do it. There are many ways to accomplish it. So that's the picture. That's why the future is exciting, and that's something that astronomers are out looking for, right? They're on the lookout for infrared signatures from stars.
Mm-hmm.
They don't see anything, even in the nearby galaxies. There's nothing like that.
Okay, so there are a couple things that are occurring to me. So,
Sure, yeah.
One, it seems like part of the assumption here in this Fermi paradox framing is that while it is possible that there are aliens out there and we simply haven't seen them yet, the underlying assumption is that the slice of time within the from the point of view of the age of the universe,
Yeah.
in which they would be traveling space, and we haven't seen them yet still, is so small that it's so statistically unlikely that we can only really look at the situation as either the aliens exist and therefore we are seeing them right now, or they don't exist and that's why we're not seeing them. It's almost a perfect 50-50 slice. It's similar to, I guess you might say, the roulette at a casino, where there's the red and black, and then there's the two non-red black that are the 0 and the 00. And effectively, the possibility of the 0 and the 00 option is what the aliens exist, but they haven't found us yet. Probability is, if the 0 and 00 were 1/1,000,000th of the size that they are on standard roulettes. And it sounds like the idea is here. And so is that basically the general assertion? Do I have that right?
I'm sorry, Joe, but I'm not familiar with roulettes, so that I struggle to follow you there.
Okay, well, okay, I guess just the idea is it's so unlikely that the aliens exist, but we haven't found them yet. We have to treat it as not mathematically significant. The only mathematically significant considerations are that they exist and therefore we've seen them, or they don't exist and that's why we don't see them.
Right. Okay. There are a number of assumptions in this, and I know the IDW listener types are likely to be finicky about listing all those assumptions instead of just glossing over them. One of those assumptions is, built into this is this idea that so much time has passed. There's no reason that a whole bunch of civilizations would pop up right now instead of distributed more evenly through time, right? If some other civilization just like ours is starting right now, right, we're not going to see them, and we could run into them out there, and that would be interesting. But the odds of that happening, if there's just two of us, is so tiny that we can dismiss that. Now, so with the 6 assumptions that make the Dyson dilemma interesting, if they're true, are basically these. Okay, so number 1, It's possible to build a Dyson swarm, and that doing so makes sense. We talked about that. I find that persuasive, but if someone else doesn't, then they won't find the Dyson dilemma interesting. Number two, it is possible to engage in interstellar colonization. We haven't talked about that very much, but there are ways you can get across a few light years. It'll take time, and maybe we need to develop hibernation technology, or maybe we can use high-powered lasers and mirrors to bounce spacecraft up to really high speeds without bringing propellant along with them. And that just requires a lot of infrastructure, but we can get there. The third assumption is that there is no source of energy superior to stars, right? So, if it's possible to, have some kind of perpetual motion machine, if we don't really understand the laws of thermodynamics as well as we do, if eventually we realize that you can, get energy out of the vacuum of space somehow without generating heat, then all of this is out the window. But we don't have any reason to think that's true right now. That's sort of more in the realm of fantasy than science, I think. And likewise with assumption number 4, this assumes that faster than light travel and time travel in going to other dimensions, this isn't possible. If you can do those things, well, all bets are off. We don't know what's going on. But to the best of our knowledge, these are not possibilities. Science is advancing, we're learning new things, but we're also starting to glimpse the hard limits of what's reasonably possible, Now, assumption number 5 is kind of interesting. That's that civilizations do not inevitably wipe themselves out. I don't know if that's true. That's people who are interested in the Fermi paradox, and this is what Enrico Fermi and the guys who were working on the nuclear bomb, while they were talking about this had to have been in their minds, right? Like, what are we doing here, right? Like, we look out at the universe and it's all dark and empty. And here we are developing the weapons of destruction that could, blast life back into the Stone Age or worse. And we're wondering why it's so quiet out there. It's kind of a creepy thought.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like the implication here is that if we're alone in space, there's 2 fundamental reasons why. Because it's either there are other aliens or there aren't, and it's just, again, the possibility that there are that we haven't seen is statistically insignificant. And then we have to assume that basically there are no sufficiently advanced aliens out there. Like, there could be planets with life, but it's not. It can take hundreds of millions of years for intelligent life to develop on these planets. So that's not necessarily a meaningful thing to say, and that's not exactly a blink in even cosmological time points of view. So
there could be tons of life out there. We're just talking about technological, like, machine tools.
Yeah, it seems to me there are 2 explanations that are being implied here, and one is that we're the first truly technologically civilization, at least within our local group, because that's what we
won the lottery. We're luckier than we can imagine.
All right, so we're the first, and that might not seem likely, but somebody had to be the first.
It's kind of the anthropic principle. It's like, somebody had to be first,
So yeah, if it wasn't us, we can say that it's unlikely, but then the one that beat us, the alien civilization that beat us, would be saying the same things about themselves, and it's inevitably true of someone. And this applies to all the groups and clusters where there is intelligent life in the universe. And so we're first, and that's why, because we beat everyone else. So we're going to be the ones. We're going to be the aliens on people's main streets. That's the assumption there. And then the second one is that we're not the first, and the ones who were first created technology that they could not control, and they destroyed themselves. And that's why we don't see them.
Exactly. Either we're very special, or we're probably screwed. That's how I lay it out. Like, there's something about this moment in history that's so difficult to get past, and I don't know if you sense this, but we seem to be creating new ways to cause the extinction of human life at a disturbing rate.
Mm-hmm.
So here's the part of the conversation where we could talk about, politics and existential risk. Because of those 2 hypotheses, hopefully we're just lucky. That would be nice. But the prudent move right, would be to assume that we're in big trouble right now, that this is the danger zone. It's like we've got this bottleneck to get past, and we need to be laser focused on getting past it, just in case we're not lucky, just in case we're not special, um, and look seriously at what are the things that actually could end all life on Earth. You know, Sam Harris thinks about this. I know he does because he talks about existential risk, and he's focused on AI mostly, I think. That's one of I've counted about nine possible ways we could do it.
Right. Yes. Sam has talked at length about how, well, basically, you have people like ISIS and similar people just within radical Islam who, if given the means to glass the surface of the earth a dozen times over, which the armaments to do so exist, they would happily do it under the belief that they would go to paradise for doing such. Many of them do, in fact, believe that. And
right. And they're far from the only group with this sort of
right.
idea.
Then there are other religious and fanatical groups with such assumptions. And then, of course, even if you abandon that, the concept of mutually assured destruction, whereby powers think, well, if I'm going to bring you down with me, could sufficiently do that job. And we thankfully avoided that through the 50 years of the Cold War, but we don't necessarily want to assume that we'll always be successful in against such standoffs in the future. And there are a lot of reasons to think we might not, because, well, if you look at what's happening, let's say in the United States, the most powerful country in the world elected a very unstable and selfish man who now has his hand within reach of the big red button. And it is one of those things where you don't know if the world could end tonight or not, as long as someone like him is in control. And while I still think it's unlikely, like, let's say at any given moment there's a 0.0001 chance that the world will be destroyed. Even if it's 0.001% chance, that's 10 times more likely.
Right, we can't sit around for 1,000 years taking those odds constantly. That's a bad game of Russian roulette.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of Russia, hey, but you know, Dan Carlin did a podcast recently on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Do you ever listen to the Hardcore History podcast?
I haven't listened to that, no. So what exactly did he elucidate on the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, I'd like to quote him. He was saying close to something that you said, and I don't know if he was quoting someone else, so apologies if he was, but he said, "We are 70 years into an experiment to see whether we can handle our new weapons technology. And the only way this experiment ends is if we find out that we can't. It's like a man walking on a tightrope over a pit of lava. 3 or 4 times his balance has wavered, but each time he caught himself. Maybe he can keep walking that tightrope for a while longer, but can he stay on it forever?" Okay, end quote. We've been I think we've been lulled into a little bit of a sense of security because the mass production of nuclear weapons that was going on has ceased lately. You know, the US and Russia agreed to stop churning these things out, but there's no reason to think that mass production could resume. And it doesn't have to be the United States or Russia or China to, you know, reignite that arms race. More and more countries are gaining the capability to do it. And, you know, after World War II, the Western powers sat down at Bretton Woods, I think it was in New Hampshire, and hammered out a new system of global commerce where the United States Navy agreed to safeguard the trade on the ocean of all countries that would join them in allying against the Soviet Union. And that has kept the peace in the world, you know, guaranteed free trade for any country that is willing to join the West. But the Soviet Union's gone. And we had another reason to keep that system in place. We needed oil. But because of the North Dakota shale oil revolution, we don't need the oil anymore. And I mean, honestly, Donald Trump is always talking crap about NATO, and he's ending the system. We're probably pulling out, right? We're going to pull the naval battle groups home sooner or later. And then the Persian Gulf is going to burn, right? And then China's not going to have enough oil. China, Japan, and India, all those teeming billions of people, are going to be out of luck while we sit fat and happy at home, the world could start burning. This is a real possibility that could happen in our lifetimes, maybe very soon. And this is just one of so many things that are happening. Right? The world is changing so quickly. We haven't talked about CRISPR, right? We haven't talked about we haven't talked about climate change, right?
Right, and that's another thing that we seem to be creating that could destroy us. So, I mean, just
Yeah,
nuclear annihilation is just one possibility. Technology could end up destroying us. Climate change, while it wouldn't be as immediately overnight, is still,
right.
especially the way we're changing it, is still something that is overnight in from a cosmological or even just an ecological point of view.
Right. Yeah. So these problems are going to come at us one at a time. We don't know which order they're coming in. Climate change is probably down the list. But if we're going to even get the chance to worry about climate change, we've got to solve 5 impossible problems to get there.
Right, and we need a certain amount of unity within humanity that's been heretofore out of our reach, and lately seems to be this seems to be less likely or less easily attainable with the amount of far right nationalist political movements that have emerged in the West and even in some other corners of the world, like in the Philippines, like in Latin America, South America. So, I mean, Brazil and Argentina specifically both come to mind. And
It's all very understandable and predictable. We're
right,
not human beings aren't going to change overnight. That's not happening. Human nature is human nature.
and it sounds to me like the fundamental problem is that technology and science are progressing faster than their vehicle, human beings, is able to adapt, because we operate based on, for the most part, a fairly specific genome. And while no human's DNA code is exactly like anyone else in the world or anyone before, there's most of our code is exactly the same, and most of us are operating according to those common traits. And our common traits generally were developed in the context of our tribal hunter-gatherer society, and we didn't have the ability to see big pictures or make decisions based on large complex systems. We were interacting with a few dozen people throughout our lives, and we operated in relatively small environments, and we might cover a great deal of land within our lifetimes, but it was on such a small and minuscule scale compared to what we have today. And even the first cities that we developed about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago were such a substantially larger scale than what I think the human genome, hunter-gatherer genome, could adapt to. And we're at what the human civilization was 4,000 years ago now, to like a power of 50 in terms of complexity and scope. And it's just one of those things where you have to wonder if the human mind and even our most gifted and intelligent leaders are actually able to grapple with the consequences of some of these issues as well as we would hope. Like, even if we could put people with the aptitude of Hawking or Einstein in positions of power consistently in every form of world leadership, in the UN and as heads of state across all the countries, would they be able to make the right decisions to solve these really big problems? You have to wonder that. And for the most part, it seems like we're failing to come close to do that.
Yeah, and I consider myself a liberal. The ideas of democracy and freedom and one person, one vote really appeals to me. And that jars against this realization that faced with the fast changing worlds and the problems we have, the average voter is not equipped to make competent decisions. And I don't have answers about what to do about that, but I wanted to ask you, you've been involved with the campaign recently, and I didn't pay much attention to it, aside from a couple things here over in my own local races. Were people talking about nuclear deterrence, any big picture stuff? Were any of the candidates have a plank in their platform that was about, bioterrorism, regulating AI, or in any of
Well,
these existential risks we talk about?
that's really not something that's considered, and that's something I've often thought about. So one thing I've thought about for many years since I was a teenager is how do we achieve a global democratic state? Because I feel like that's something we're going to have to try and accomplish at some point.
I agree at some point,
And
yeah.
and that was before I had a lot of these really macro existential concerns that we're discussing right now. And my realization of these issues has only furthered my view that a global democratic state at some point is necessary to solve these, because a lot of what prevents us from solving these problems is an issue of how we are funneling power, geopolitical power, insufficiently to solve these. And eventually we just need to get it down to one funnel. And I think a democratic state is appealing because there's potential for abuses that come from dictatorships. But then at the same time, what gets votes isn't necessarily what is necessary to solve these big problems at the end of the day.
Right.
Jordan
That's the
Peterson,
tragedy of
right?
democracies. Yeah, and they just, yeah.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson is quoted saying, the person who's starving to death doesn't care about their carbon footprint. He said something like that.
Right.
And as much as, and I'm a Democrat. I'm active in the Democratic Party. As much as Democrats often like to think of themselves as the more educated or intellectual party, and that's not just a stereotype by Republicans. That's true. That they will sometimes talk about this fact. Democrats will. That as much as they may think that, as much as that might even be true, they don't talk about these bigger picture issues. They don't even talk about, well, do we want a global democratic state sometimes? Now, I think that's something that if you're very serious about politics and about government and about the underlying ideas behind them and about someone who, and if you're very serious if you're seriously advertising yourself as an individual or as the political party that thinks about the future, you would think about what the future of global politics and global governance would look like. But this is really impossible to find within the Democratic Party. And certainly within the course of this campaign, the issues were very, I mean, they come down to the household stuff. How are people going to pay for healthcare? How are people going to get jobs? The only really big issue that is constantly put forward in the Democratic Party is the issue of climate change, to its credit.
To its credit, I agree.
Beyond that's the exception. And the fact that it isn't is very concerning. What that means is that because elections are inevitable, the seats will always be filled. The leaders who fill these seats are basically they're going to have to think of solutions to these problems. Any clear mandate from their people, they're just going to have to wing it. And we have to trust that the people who were not elected to solve these problems will nevertheless have the qualifications and the ability to seek answers correctly and I guess you could say court experts sufficiently so that these solutions can be put into policy effectively. And we're really working up against a grain of inefficiency, as I see it, just speaking from someone who's sort of on the inside of the political system and seeing exactly who we're putting forward and what even the best and brightest of our political class seems to offer. So, I mean, I hope that gives you an idea of where things are going. But I would agree with what I think was your assumption, is that it's not optimistic.
Yeah. So I'm out here in Trump land now. I've moved from Seattle to Wisconsin. And now I don't have the kind of view that you have of the Democratic Party for the Republicans, but from what I can see, it's even worse than the Republican Party. The base of the Republican Party isn't concerned about these kinds of fears, and they're actually excited about them because they're anticipating the second coming quite soon. And
Yes.
and they want it to happen. Like I did I mention that I was raised by fundamentalist missionaries in Papua New Guinea?
Yes, you mentioned that in the sub. You mentioned that detail in the sub. I
Right.
remember.
Yeah. So it's a bit of an extreme version of that subculture. Well, I don't know if it's right to call it a subculture because it's so many people. I think it must be like something like 20% of the U.S. population, maybe a bit less. But um, from talking to my parents about why are we out here, what are we doing, as a kid, it became pretty clear that we are out here trying to bring about the second coming of Christ and the end of the world, right? Because there are some verses in the Bible where, he's not going to come back until every people has heard the word of the Lord, that kind of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's this yearning all over in the New Testament for the end of this world and the coming of the next world, right? And when people see scary stuff in the news, honestly, if you're of a certain type of conservative evangelical bent, it kind of gets you a bit excited. You think like, hey, maybe the end's coming, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make you vote the way we would hope people would. Not that we have anyone in particular to vote for on these issues.
Right, and I have encountered several evangelical Christians in person or online who are of this persuasion. They look at what happens in the news, and this is going back 10 years even. Who are like, this is a sign that the end times are coming in our lives. They're so certain of this, and when you vote, I think it's a safe assumption to say that people vote based on their certainties they have about their world. They don't vote based on their uncertainties they have about the world.
That's an interesting. I haven't thought about that before. I guess that's easier to do, isn't it, psychologically?
Right. I think that's a pretty good heuristic to apply to politics.
Yeah. The scary thing is, as we've been talking about, with the way history has gone and the implications of the Dyson dilemma and Fermi paradox, there's a chance. I mean, maybe we missed something in our assumptions, and it's probably likely that we did, but there's a big chance that they're right, and that the world is about to come to an end. And it's not. I don't know if you're religious, Joe, but I can't help thinking that it's taken us billions of years of suffering and enduring hierarchies and death and competition, slowly clawing our way to where we are now, and for one species out of all the species on Earth to suddenly terminate the whole thing in just a few decades of being distracted, it turns the whole thing from a sort of tragic, heroic story into a tragic farce. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, it makes it seem as if we truly do not deserve all that we have now because we're going to piss it away. And
we're sort of carrying the torch for all of life on Earth, the whales, everything, Only we have the ability and therefore the responsibility to keep it together and save it, because even if none of the things we talked about happen today, the sun is still going to turn into a red giant, right?
Yeah, and while that's usually described as being a process that will, like the remaining lifetime of the sun will continue for another 5 billion years before it sheds its outer layers and becomes a dwarf star. It will be.
It gets hot before then.
Yes,
Yeah.
So it'll be about 1 billion years before the expansion of its surface creates an increased temperatures on Earth that we can't even have liquid water anymore. And
right.
that's after conditions become so hot that most forms of life are able. I think it'll be about what was it? I think it's going to be about 600 million years when a certain form of photosynthesis is no longer possible. That is currently just the main type of photosynthesis that sustains life on Earth. I believe it's the form that complex plant life engages in. I think the only form of photosynthesis that will be possible at that point will be the unicellular kind that occurs in the oceans. And because the Earth was also much hotter early on as well, and that was the photosynthesis we had. It had to get cooler for certain other kinds to work, and a biologist, if Brett Weinstein were here, which hopefully he will be one day, if he were here, he could probably tell us exactly what that kind is. But yes, it is one of those things where Earth has gone through most of its period of being in the Goldilocks zone, and we're coming up on the end now in terms of the span of life on Earth. Life has been around for about 3.5 billion years, and we're about 75. Well, no, yeah, about 75% of the way through, or 80% of the way through, and
yeah, we're in the fourth quarter. I don't think we can count on the raccoons to refigure
right.
out civilization.
So it's up to us to sort of figure out what we're going to do to save ourselves, as well as the species of the planet, or at least the species that are worth saving, depending on what you consider is worth saving. And so
I wouldn't judge. I would save all of them if I could.
Okay,
That would be my happy choice.
that's noble of you. And to some extent, we might find that it's the energy efficient way to do things is to have biodiversity as we colonize the galaxy in these rich environments. And we may even find that that's also the sort of form of living that we enjoy. If we're trusting that our human sense of adventure will continually push us out to the frontiers of the cosmos, then it probably stands to reason that we'll want to assign certain attributes to these otherwise desolate areas and make them full of life that with which we can interact and that we can essentially make into our playgrounds.
Right. We could be looking at right now at a universe that's, compared to what it could be, almost devoid of meaning, and we could fill it. It's hard to imagine the significance of that achievement right now. But we live at a pretty dramatic moment in history, all things considered. It really, I think it puts perspective on the petty controversies that tend to absorb our politics. The gravity of this moment in history.
Right. So I think one good question to have, one that I think is somewhat controversial, but it is worth considering with how high the stakes are, is you and I have talked about how we want a global democratic state. I think a lot of that relies on the assumption that democracy is what's going to get it right, if there is a system that will get it right. But we do have to wonder if maybe that's a good assumption. As we've said, recent events such as the election of Donald Trump, such as Brexit, such as what we're seeing with a lot of these often successful right-wing movements throughout the world, is that democracy can get it wrong and horribly wrong. And there are previous chapters in history that attest to that, right? That the Nazis rose in a democratic system that failed.
Yeah, that's true.
And some communist governments have risen in democratic systems that failed. Others didn't. Some others just went straight into the communist dictatorship without a democratic interlude. But that's what we see sometimes. And we have to wonder if that's possible. So if not democracy, that means we would have to be under some sort of autocratic system that was sufficiently benign on the overall balance sheet to be justified, because a democracy that for any moment could be flawed enough with such great powers of destruction at hand could be what really does us in at the end. Like, it just takes Donald Trump pushing the big red button one time to destroy 90% of life on Earth. The things that can survive the nuclear fallout will survive and see the next wave of life. But it could be so deadly that life on Earth might never again become sufficiently sophisticated to reinvent technology quick enough to escape the expansion of the sun that will cook the Earth. So even if we don't destroy life immediately on Earth, we may destroy it in the long run by just crippling our ability to expand into the cosmos, or at least develop a method where the sun doesn't destroy the Earth or something.
Which is doable. There are ways to do that.
Right. We could take energy out, I think, of our orbit so that we drift away and therefore the amount of heat we're getting as the sun expands would not be so great. That's one possibility, as I understand it.
Yeah, but by that, if we get to that point where we have the power to do that, it'll be more a matter of preserving the Earth for sentimental reasons, not because we really need it anymore.
Right.
But yeah, there are a lot of ways to do that. Now, I was wondering, it sounds like I kind of agree with you. The way I put it is, I think we need a new constitutional convention. Not that I dislike our Constitution, but sooner or later, we're going to need another constitutional convention of some kind. Either that or we're going to have a revolution we can't afford. Who would be on your short list to send to hammer things out?
For America or for the globe?
Gosh, I was just thinking America, but
well, if we're just keeping it to America, this may not surprise a lot of people, but I would put Bernie Sanders on that.
Okay.
Because I mean, he clearly understands, I think, the flaws that come with our current political system. I mean, if there's anything that led to our democracy failing, it could perhaps be said that it's that we're not as democratic as we could be. So the influence of money in politics, which it comes at the direct expense of one person, one vote, is probably one thing that led these one persons with their one votes to vote erratically and erroneously. We could have that could address things like that, I think, would be good. Probably another one would be Robert Reich, just because he has a good understanding of economic theory. And I think often what we find with a lot of these far-right nationalist movements is that when economic systems have moments of weakness, that also inflames these nationalist tensions that leads to these events that we're seeing. And I think most of the economic theory we need to sort of mitigate that fear when operating within democratic systems exists. And I think we've sufficiently cracked most of the economic code that we can develop fairly foolproof systems. I mean, if we look at the 2008 recession, which happened after several years of economic observation and recording and development of theory, what we found that what caused it was very similar to what caused it in 1999. There were so many parallels and similarities that it was hardly a surprise that it happened. I mean, we repealed the Glass-Steagall Act, and within 10 years we had another financial crash. I don't think the parallels are too strange to anyone who's paying close enough attention. And I think another crash is on its way, because most of the fundamental things that led to it that created weaknesses in our economy have remained intact. They were not solved during the Obama years, not so much for lack of effort by Obama, but it just didn't happen. He did the stimulus bill, but you needed more than that. You needed to rebuild the economy and then shore up what was rebuilt so that it couldn't get weak again. And what we did is we grew the economy again with stimulus, but we didn't remove factors such as wide income inequality, for one, or the extensive costs of things like education and healthcare that have contributed to the weakening middle class in America, and therefore the lack of sufficient purchasing power to keep the wheel of the economy spinning. So these are things I think we need to keep in mind if we really want to have a democratic system that doesn't fail. Then we have to have economies that themselves don't fail. Because if you want to make somebody do something crazy in the ballot box, one way to do that, I mean, if we just go back to Jordan Peterson's statement, as person who's starving to death doesn't care about their carbon footprint, you have to remove that state of immediate fear that people are experiencing. And when you're about to lose your home and about to be that person on that street starving to death, which is true for several thousand Americans, it just takes one little thing to go wrong before they enter that state of life. That's what you want to do. You want to shore up those guts. But even then, that's just, again, I think talking about politics in terms of it's traditionally discussed, and what we really need is a constitution that will discuss it in terms as it is not often discussed, right? That people aren't talking about global states. We need to have a constitution that directly considers this. The founding fathers did not imagine that we would ever assemble a global democratic state, and there's no language for how we would easily enter one. Could we simply have a treaty approved by the Senate and the President that does that, or would we need to amend the Constitution to make it inferior to some sort of global charter? And it's not clear what the pathway forward is. And even then, if we assume it's the one that is requires a constitutional amendment, that is a very tough process to do. It is not easy to get something amended into the Constitution, at least in a short span of time. For amendments that don't have a deadline, once they're approved by a state government, that all you have to do is wait until another state government does the same. And there have been amendments to the Constitution that got approved after decades of consent by state governments when the right coalition was in power at those points to do it. But if we need something quick, and it seems like we're going to need something relatively quick, it sounds like for some of these issues we don't have the luxury of decades to amend the Constitution. That's a consideration as well. And then we need to think about, I think this is true of any political system in the next century, we need to think about the influence of AI, because AI will do so much to affect how we govern that there's so much that AI could do that I would think even our current Constitution, which for its time and in many ways for our time is well crafted.
Yeah, it's an amazing document.
Yeah, but what AI will be able to do will just make our Constitution look stupid and inefficient. And then that also then brings in the question is, we can talk about these things in democratic systems, is if we were to create an autocratic system that is dictated by some form of AI that is sufficiently programmed to serve the needs of human beings without corruption, might that be a better system? If we're worried about human error, why not remove the factor of human error? We can mitigate human error by effectively introducing the disciplines of the scientific method, where we have several people involved and try to filter out biases with multiple perspectives. But there's things that humans, even as a species, can overcome in terms of understanding and information processing that perhaps an AI, which would, it with sufficient technological advancements that we could see within our lifetimes, would be able to take on. And then, so we might want to wonder about that. Yeah.
I agree that if we as a global society agreed on what our goals are, then creating an AI to govern us would make a lot of sense. The problem is that we don't agree on what our goals are. And, eventually I do agree that the end game is to become some sort of unified political entity where we don't play us versus them games within our own species anymore. But in the short term, it seems like a pretty crazy idea to do a one world government now. And I mean, if you just think about what would happen if climate change was accelerated, if we had to solve these problems now, the last thing in the world you would want to do would be to create a sort of like Schengen area that included the United States, right? Where anyone in the world who wanted could just come here. Our society would struggle to survive that. Like if we're talking about getting through this bottleneck, it would be good enough for us to launch a gene bank to Mars. That's what Elon Musk is trying to do, right? He's hoping to get all our eggs out of one basket. We don't need the whole world on board with the program to pull that off. We do need a major economy behind it. And then once we've diversified and we're safe, then we could afford to integrate perhaps, and maybe it would be the safest thing to do. But have you ever thought about this? If climate change is real and it's happening, we're really going to need a wall on our southern border.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, so if we don't stop it and the glaciers sufficiently melt, the land-based ones sufficiently melt, the human displacement will be so immense that
Right. It could
it will,
collapse all of civilization. It could.
the geopolitical consequences will be like nothing we've ever seen. It will be a bigger event than World War II.
I don't doubt it. Now, so national borders in this sort of case seem to me sort of like, um, waterproof bulkheads on a large ocean liner, right? So you're the Titanic, you hit an iceberg, things go a little bit better than they did historically. Part of the ship floods, but you close down the borders and you write off the bits that flooded, but the whole thing stays afloat, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have those boundaries, I mean, look at our bodies. We are we are walls within walls. There's our nucleus, and then the cell wall. There's organ structures. Those are like walls. We've got our skin, and then on top of that, we put clothes on, and we live in walled structures, right? And then we put borders around our countries, right? This is a very defensive posture, and that's because life is fragile. These complex systems are very fragile, and I think dropping those borders shouldn't be done too lightly. We should be very careful when we do that.
Yeah, I agree that the borders are not arbitrary, and while I long for a global democratic state, there are various social and cultural issues at work here. So part of the concern that many in the West have about allowing more immigration from the Middle East, whether it's just the typical immigration, right, like folks from North Africa, for example, there's a lot of concerns that they just, because of the values they have and their beliefs, that it will have negative consequences for Western society. Because if you have people who don't believe in women's rights, who don't believe in homosexuals' rights, who believe in honor killings, who think that they can kill people who leave the religion, none of that is coherent with even the less advanced parts of the West. Right, there are some areas of the West that are models of human behavior that have taken all the good of the Enlightenment and none of the bad, and then there are some that are, manage to achieve a net balance of good and bad of Western ideals. But you take what is much of the Islamic world, what is mainstream there, and you try to put it in our even the less progressed parts of the West. It just does not fit well. And then you figure, when we talk about the tendency of people to make errors within a democratic system, these are people who have values that increase the chances of errors in a democratic system. They'd be participating in a democratic system. They're very often going from non-democratic systems that don't have control of a nuclear arsenal into democratic systems that have control of nuclear arsenals, as well as all the other forms of highly developing technologies that could kill us. And you have to trust that there won't be some abuse of that or use of that toward destructive ends, when we know that very often the most radical of these civilizations will use it for that purpose. And I think one of the most discouraging things is that when you look at the phenomenon of ISIS, in part what has made them so successful is the fact that they could put videos of them torturing, maiming, and gratuitously murdering civilians, and they get Muslims who were born and raised in the West to come and join their armies and beef their numbers. Like they've had thousands of recruits from the West, people who grew up in democracies with rights as citizens. I think there's been about 1,000 from the United States alone. And
As a percentage, that's not too bad.
That's not too bad. I mean, 1,000. I mean, they're. I think the size of their military has been about 50,000 at its greatest. That's not small. And it's been enough, especially considering how well trained it has been in its heyday. I mean, ISIS is mostly defeated now, but like that. So people who have, who are first generation there's something about Islamic doctrine that seems to be so unifying that they would willingly go over there, join these armies, join in. They would see the appeal in the slaughter and murder and rape of civilians, and go over there with the only common source of identity being adherence to the Islamic faith, and they would take part in these atrocities. And that is the amazing thing to me as well. There are even Western women who follow the Islamic faith that have seen this and have gone to ISIS-controlled area to find husbands like this because that it's cool, and they've seen the same propaganda, and so it is concerning that ISIS can basically announce the worst of itself, and that's actually been a selling point for it. And while this would be account for a minority of Islamic civilization worldwide, it's one of those things. I guess you go back to the Donald Trump aspect, right? It's Donald Trump. With Donald Trump, it's not necessarily likely that he'll push the big red button and instigate the end of mankind, but it's sufficiently more likely than it would have otherwise been to be concerning. And I think, given what is mainstream within Islam, and this is just Islam we're talking about, there are other things in the world that are problematic that make integration difficult. But if you just look at Islam, that alone is very concerning. I mean, how many millions of people, and how many shrewd Osama bin Laden types will manage to get through before you have such a person who's able to push the big red button as well?
Yeah, that's what I think about that as Moore's Law of Armageddon. I don't know if I mentioned it, but if Osama bin Laden had the tools back in the 90s that he would have today, we would be in bad shape. And it's only going to get worse, right? So conversations like when we start talking about Islam, I don't know about you. I know almost no Muslims. I've met maybe 8 or 10 in my life, just acquaintances. That feels to me like a problem I can't do anything about. It's so far away, and it's with groups and circles of people that are never going to hear anything I say, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they've always been with us, right? These kinds of ideas. It's not new, and we're going to have to find a way to live with it, or perish, or win the war of ideas. I don't know how are we going to win the war of ideas when we're literally launching drone strikes against them. That seems like a tough lift.
Right. It is a bit of an odd situation because it's difficult to bridge that gap when we're effectively in a state of armed conflict between the West and much of Islamic civilization. Obviously, there are some conflict where we get along. We have a depressingly positive relationship with Saudi Arabia, for example, and many other oil-providing states. And
the Democrats could be helpful there. I don't know if is this part of the Democratic Party platform to completely sever friendly ties with Saudi Arabia?
I think that's growing in appeal lately, but it is one of those things that's a catch-22 because Democrats want us to be more tolerant and accepting and friendly toward the Middle East, and cutting off one of our few Middle Eastern allies would be difficult to reconcile with that. Even if you look at the very honest critiques there are of the Saudi government, it is nonetheless it's nonetheless an example of that culture and an example of those people. I mean, Osama bin Laden came from Saudi Arabia, and so it's a friendly it's an example of a friendly contradiction to the traditional narrative that we can't get along with the Middle East. And if we, and you know, there could be implications. Well, if we won't even befriend the Saudis anymore, I guess we won't. You know, other Muslim nations could look at it and say, I guess they're not going to be friends with anyone. I think maybe a better way to go would, if we want to look to make friends within the Islamic world, is look at the Kurds in Syria and Iraq, who have had to defend themselves, their families, and their territory from the breaches of the Assad regime and ISIS. I think recognizing Kurdistan as a state, an example of, because the Kurds believe in liberal democracy. That's what they are establishing for themselves in the territory they're able to control. And like
they seem like a good bunch, don't they? I like them.
They're the most some of the most enlightened people within the Islamic world,
and they're so brave. You know, they've been fighting a tough fight against really big enemies for a very long time.
Yes, and if Syria and Iraq sufficiently prove that they will not defend them from the rape and pillage of ISIS, and if only the Kurds will defend themselves, then only the Kurds should have a claim to that territory. And I think that would be a good step to go. I mean, so much of what the mistake of the United States has been is that it's proved that it's willing to sabotage the democratic systems for its own, in my view, short-term geopolitical gains. And the removal of the Iranian democratic government to reestablish the Shah during the 1950s is a tragic example of that. I'm often a fan of Eisenhower as a president, but that is one area where I sharply disagree with what he did. And I think it really set us back in many ways in the Middle East. And what it ended up doing was leading to an even worse regime under the Shah. But lately, the Ayatollah regime has shown a lot of willingness to defer to its democratically elected positions. There's a new generation of Iranians who grew up on the internet and with technology, and this is especially true within Tehran, who share a lot of these modern liberal values. When I say liberal, I mean Hobbes and Voltaire and the Enlightenment. We share these liberal values, and would actually probably commit to them pretty well. And what we need to do, I think, is start giving a positive to those areas, especially if we're going to cut off what few Middle Eastern allies that we do have, because
it seems to me like what we need to do is stop playing realpolitik and start to take the moral high ground in terms of who we're allies with and who we're supporting. Because if there's anything we could do to hurt the cause of the liberals in Iran, it's to behave badly in the region, right? Because that just gives fuel to their enemies, right? But they do look to us, as our role model, good or bad. And if we're making cynical deals, selling arms to the Saudis and hanging the Kurds out to dry, it's not gonna help, right?
I think we have to appreciate that America, from day one, has always been a role model to the rest of the world. When the Declaration of Independence was written, copies of it were quickly disseminated throughout Latin America. And
Did you say Latin America? You broke up there for a second.
Yes, Latin America. And it gave encouragement to those countries to declare their own independence and establish their own democratic systems. And they haven't always been successful at that, but our status as a role model to the rest of the world has been there since July 4th, 1776, and it continues to this day. People look to us to set an example for how we can be both a powerful nation and one that respects human rights and governs through a democratic system. And I think you're right. We need to lead by example more than we have, and not lead by sheer power. I guess to put it in Petersonian terms, right?
Do what is meaningful, not what is expedient.
Well, he puts an emphasis on competence, right? Rise through the hierarchy based on competence, not through dominance or power and abuse. I think we need to show competence in the way
Sure.
we
Yeah.
lead ourselves geopolitically. Now, we've talked a lot about nuclear annihilation, about how the integration with Islamic civilization is difficult, whether it's within a geopolitical system or through immigration. But there are other dangers that we haven't touched on. We've talked about what I feel are the obvious ones, and I think you've alluded to a few more. Could you sort of get into what some of these other threats are in terms of that come with increasing technology, and then the other hurdles to overcoming them that exist in terms of how they affect us geopolitically and the like?
Okay. Well, the next one on my list might take our podcast back a step in terms of our serious tone we've been taking. But have you noticed how video games have been getting better? I found Pac-Man pretty riveting when I was a little kid. But there's this strange chance that video games might get so good that they become preferable in almost every case to real life. And if at that point our automation is quite good, it's scary to think about what could happen. Did you see Ready Player One or read the book?
I haven't seen or read it. I want to because
it's not great. I don't recommend it, but
okay.
It did paint a picture of a world in which the video game had gotten so good that the real world was left to neglect, right? And and civilization was falling to pieces, and you could see it whenever they logged out of the game.
Yeah, I've thought about this sometimes. So one thing, maybe I might get some flack for this, but one thing that is, I guess, a more ready example for me of a virtual having the kind of relevance in which it is basically your life and not the life in which your body exists, is that the anime Sword Art Online. And I know a lot of people hate it.
Sorry, the what online? I think I missed that.
Sword Art Online. It's about this virtual reality video game that's made like in the 2020s, and first of its kind, full immersion, and you're unconscious in a VR helmet that's connected to your brain, and on its launch day, it is revealed that the creator of the game rigged it so that players could not log out, and if they tried to deactivate or take off their VR helmets, it would release a massive burst of microwave radiation that would try to kill them. So they're trapped in the game. And they said the only way they'll be let out is if they can beat the game and escape. And the game is very thorough and difficult, so it takes a long time. And people are in there for about 2 years before they get out. And in the meantime, they develop their own culture and system and stuff. And there are people in this game who, some people come to terms with their imprisonment in it and actually sort of say, well, I kind of like my life in here more than I did when I was just a person in the real world. And then, of course, there's, I think, the idea of the Matrix, that we might find the Matrix so convincing because it's a sufficient allure to our senses that we could be systematically trapped within it. And it'd be very hard to get most of us out. And some people do get out, but they have to be helped. And some people, like I forget his name, the trader in the first one who tries to sell them out to the machines, he says, I'd rather be in the Matrix because life was better in there. And,
was that Cyber?
Yeah, Cyber. Yeah,
Cypher. Yeah, okay.
Cypher. Yeah, and I thought about that too. And I've kind of been working on a short story that is about a virtual world. I actually published the first part of it on Medium recently, if anyone wants to look at that. But part of what I'm imagining as I write this, or what I might write, let's say, in another corroborating short story, is the idea that people find the virtual world more fulfilling and enthralling than the reality in which we currently exist, and that could have some problems. So if we want to talk,
It already happens. I mean, have you lost any friends to this?
I don't know if I've lost any friends to video games, say, but I could just imagine a situation. If we talk about democracy failing, what if a sufficient number of people are just not showing up to vote on election day because they're too busy playing their goddamn video games? That could have huge civilizational consequences.
I think of that one might not be too bad. Hopefully only the people who have, been interested enough and done the research are going out to vote. We don't want, like, if you don't know anything about anything, you don't want that person voting, do you?
I suppose I would prefer if people who haven't suffered damage to their frontal lobes, the people who have suffered damage to their frontal lobes, I would not feel bad if they missed out on voting.
Okay, so you're just putting the bar in a different place. I understand that.
Right. Or I'm basically I'm talking about the same basic principle. Is that there's some amount of cognitive ability where at some point you either want someone to vote or want them not to. Like, obviously I don't want squirrels to vote.
Sure.
Yeah. So
I worry more about people. A lot of wasted potential. A lot of good minds just don't find the world interesting enough, compared to what they can get in a video game. And it's
because if I suppose
it's artwork, it's a lot of drudgery. You gotta.
If you're a truly intelligent person, there's a lot more that you can find stimulating because you're able to think abstractly and do more with stimuli, and in a environment that is providing you with this trove of varied stimuli and is able to provide the specific stimuli that you seek and with which you can work. It'd be
right
to resist that kind of temptation, because if you think of the humans as a species as basically this very unique set of organisms that are problem solvers fundamentally.
That's us.
I don't think there's any other species where you could quite say that. There's some problem-solving abilities, of course, that apply to most predators, for example, but nothing to the scale of human beings. The fact that we could go from, if you compare the hunter-gatherer humans to, let's say, chimpanzees, you could say that there was not a lot of our behaviors that was that much different. A lot of what we did was very, very similar. But if you compare our ancestors, who were of the same species that we are now, from the hunter-gatherer days to us today, well, then the difference between us and the chimpanzees is huge. And so we were able to go from that biomechanical toolkit and go into something far more complicated, because fundamentally we're problem solvers and we thrive on the complex. And we also have an innate sense that there are problems that need to be solved, and that I think this comes from the fact that the world is dangerous and we were always in danger, and so solving problems is a good way to make sure you stay alive. And so we are driven to solve problems because our brain thinks that by doing so we are increasing our survival, and so we are seeking out problems to solve. And the virtual world, especially in a world where we are solving so many of our material problems, where we don't have the risk of death anymore, a virtual world in many ways would become our only way to seek those out. But then there's always going to be a baseline of things that we will want to keep. And it may be the case that the virtual world will offer us many fictitious problems at such a rate that it outpaces the erosion of our problems in the real world. So we have people latching on to virtual problem solving while there are still problems in the real world to be solved. And that sounds like it could end up being a threat. Is that what you were getting at?
Sure, it's that dynamic coupled with the fact that the games are just evolving faster than our ability is to, notice that these aren't real problems. The games, as long as they keep getting better, it's similar to the AI argument, right? As long as they continue to get better at doing what they're meant to do, which is to capture our attention, and if they continue to get better indefinitely, Perhaps AI start designing these games. I don't know. That does seem like a danger. I don't know how strong that attraction could become, right? I don't consider myself immune. I've wasted time in video games, and it's exactly those types of puzzle solving games in my case. But for different people, it's different types of games, and there's different companies that are specializing at capturing the attention of different types of people, and they're just going to get better at it. I don't know what it would take to fight that, because what legislation to prevent video? No, I don't know. That doesn't seem quite in line with what I'd like to see, but it might be necessary. Maybe some sort of cultural meme that that puts a prohibition on gaming to that degree that's almost religious in strength. To sort of serve as a bulwark, sort of like how the Mormons have it against drinking and dancing or whatever. Or Islam has a lot of these prohibitions in it that are very strong and might be strong enough to hold up against that sort of encroachment on our attention. Yeah, I don't know what the answer is going to look like, but we're going to have one, aren't we?
Yes, it seems well because, well, like you said, there's a lot of wasted potential, not just in individuals, but there are a lot of factors that contribute to declining birth rates. But I can't help but wonder if some of it has to do with the fact that a lot of these men are spending their time.
Are you talking about the incel thing?
Well, not so much incels, but I think there are men who, in fact, I feel like when we talk about incels, we're talking about people who, despite their best efforts, could never get a woman to like them and therefore reproduce with them. What I'm getting at more is there are, in fact, men who are definitely capable of that. Very charming and attractive men who nonetheless find the allure of video games so much that they waste more of their time on that, less time on courting females so that we can keep our birth rates up, which, for right now, we do need steady birth rates for much of our system to continue to function healthily. That's still a part of the equation that needs to be maintained. And so
I don't think we're worried at this moment about not having enough people. We've probably got enough people right now, don't we?
I think we're worried about not having enough young people. I think that's the issue. Enough young, able, working people. Because when people get old, it's just they either can't work or they work so terribly. You're just better off having a younger, healthier person do it. We don't have yet enough medical advancement that you can be a 100-year-old person, working something in a difficult manner. And by the time we get to that level of medical advancement, we'll probably have achieved so much in technological advancement that most work will not need to be done anymore. And so in the meantime, we need to maintain our flow of young people through new births so that we can have this labor pool to keep the system going. And so part of me wonders if, so when we talk about wasted potential, right, there are potential, especially because human IQ is gradually rising.
Is it?
Yes.
Are you talking about the Flynn effect?
Yes. There are several potentially more intelligent people who will be born with each generation. And if we're reducing our birth rates, we're essentially reducing the next wave of Isaac Newtons and Albert Einsteins that could be born. And then even people who aren't that great, who are just the next tier below that, who could be developing our society more. And that sounds like a case of wasted potential that comes from people spending too much time on video games. And even those that are born, could be caught up in that sweep, right? Even Isaac Newton, as intelligent as he was, clearly suffered some cognitive weakness. Like 90% of his writings were attempts to decode the Bible. And I don't think that's an overestimation. I think it was actually close to 90%. And in retrospect, that was just a complete waste of his genius mind when you consider what he gave us with calculus and optics. That was just not a good use of his time. And yet that's what he was obsessed with, because effectively we saw that his mind was hijacked by the sociocultural forces in which he lived. And we have no reason to think that a genius born today would be any different and any less prone to being hijacked by such forces. And I think, so I think when you talk about, let's say, the threat of video games and how much stimuli that work there, because a virtual, especially when we talk about virtual reality, which is where video games seem to be gravitating. I think it will be the case that relatively soon, when people think of video games, they will think of virtual reality environments. Just like when video games first came out, right? What people thought of were these very short and simple games in arcades. In our generation, when people talk about video games, we think of more complex things that you play at home on a private, personally owned console. I think what the next standard will be is these virtual environments in which people play. And I think as we get to that, we have to think there's not only the social-cultural forces, because when it's a virtual environment like that, it is often the case that you can interact with other people. But then there's just the other things you can put into a virtual environment to overload the senses and make it experience pleasures that, frankly aren't true in reality. I mean, even if you just go see a movie, there are movies that look more realistic than real life, the way they're shot, which I think is weird. But
that is weird, yeah.
And,
how could that be?
Right, and one thing I've written in my short story that I recently published was one of the characters, they're drinking this unique beverage called hazel juice, and they just sort of marvel at how they can taste it. And not only how they can taste it, but that it's a completely original taste that has it's not based on anything in the real world where they're just feeding you the information of something you already know. It's something they invented completely, that they're sneaking into you through your neural pathways, and it's part of the game, and they're marveling at that. And I assume that will very much, that sense of marvel at the experience will become very much a part of these virtual gaming environments, and that it's when you think about just what the human genome currently allows for, that's very concerning. The only way I think we could address the problem is if we manage to edit the genome so that we're better equipped to deal with these sorts of problems, so that we don't get tricked by them, we don't fall into these addictive behaviors. But I have to wonder, how long will that take? How long will we get consumed by these bad habits that have huge social consequences before we either decide to fix them, before they become enough of a problem that we realize we need to fix them, or before we even have the technology? Like, will virtual reality and its potentially corrosive effects become a fact of life sooner than our ability to modify the human genome? I
would guess yes. I think so.
I would guess yes as well. And so I think those are the things we need to look at, and we need to regulate the video game industry, because we know the video game industry will try to manipulate gamers to get more money out of them. They program it into their games. They use things like Skinner boxes, which if you're not familiar,
no, I've never heard of that.
Oh, okay. Well, basically, it's a sort of a nickname. It's an informal nickname based on these boxes in which a psychologist known as B.F. Skinner designed. And basically, he put these pigeons in boxes, and he had them like push a button or trigger a lever or something that would produce a treat reward sometimes. All right, not every time. And then sometimes the birds would do specific actions, like ritualistic actions, before pushing it, thinking that it would produce the reward. And what has been found in similar studies is that use environments and scenarios that are called Skinner boxes, where there's a occasional reward, is that it can encourage you can encourage a behavior through less frequent rewards, because the existence of the reward creates incentive, but the lack of abundance keeps it interesting. It's basically, it prevents diminishing returns. And so it's sort of like why the lottery is effective in many ways. Now, some of it's also the big size of the pot, but the way the lottery works is often you don't win the big prize. You win $20, right? and someone's like, I won $20. Well, no, you got a $20 rebate on the $50 worth of tickets you bought over the last year. So, if you win the $20 ticket, you're not really a winner. In the grand scheme, you're a loser. You've probably put in more money than you've it's certainly true of lottery ticket buyers as a collective. They put in more money than they win. That's why it works. That's why casinos work. Casinos all have games based on fine-tuned statistical probabilities that given enough volume, they will run a profit. And that's the way the lottery works. Given enough volume with a certain statistical probabilities and the percentage they're just willing to give out as a reward, the lottery system will always make money for whatever program the government is trying to fund. But it's bad for the individual. And it's often the individuals who themselves don't have a lot of money and are buying tickets because they're desperate. And then you pair that desperation with a psychologically manipulative effect where it has a sense of reward that does not to scale with the loss that actually is occurring. And so, video game companies exploit a system of behavior like that, as well as other psychological behaviors that are common in humans, to make their games more addicting, and so that more people will put money into them. And then, but even more nefariously, we see governments trying to use gaming systems to manipulate and coerce their people. We're seeing China essentially doing that with what is essentially becoming a very advanced karma system. You take like Reddit karma or whatever, or Facebook likes, and you put that into everyday behavior.
It sounds like that episode of Black Mirror. Did you see that one?
No, I don't watch Black Mirror, but there was an episode of Community where basically people give each other like a rating of like 5 stars or 1 star, and all the 5 stars basically get all the power and abuse it. And
it's really shocking that China is doing this. I haven't heard much about it, just a couple of quick articles. I can hardly believe it. It doesn't seem real. Like, what is this, a real like live dystopia unfolding in front of us, like a sci-fi
right?
Of
And this is something I discussed recently as well. And so one thing we have to consider is, again, we talk about failures in the democratic system.
What if this system ends up being the really successful thing that outcompetes democracies?
Right. Or what if there's an aberration where something like a Donald Trump event happens, and they say, we're going to legalize this action in the video game industry such that these manipulative behaviors can occur. And, let's say the 4 years we have before we can have another election and change those laws is all that we need for such a destabilizing effect to occur that it just wrecks the whole system. Because I think in 4 years you could get a sufficiently high number of people addicted to something or manipulated into bad habits that, at that scale, that it could have bad effects. And then, of course, yes, we look at what China's doing. And what if it's not even so much that video game companies will be allowed to do bad things, but what if that's the year that the American government, the democratically elected American government, decides to implement a similar policy? And once it's in place, will we be able to come out of it?
Yeah, maybe not. And it seems likely that sooner or later we will experiment with it, whether it's a good idea or not.
Well, exactly, because it's an unusual system. It's a system that essentially thrives on incentives. And normally a system that thrives on incentives is good, right? It's often been found pretty well by now that if you want to motivate behavior in human beings, incentives is a more effective as well as a more humane way to do it than punishment, right? And that's why things like restorative and rehabilitative justice are gaining traction in the West as opposed to the traditional retributive model. But this is a way of taking the system of incentives and its supposedly benign output and turning that on its head.
It almost seems coercive.
Yes, well, and I think there are some ways at a large enough scale that's what becomes the case. So I really do share your view that video games while they don't seem as serious, can definitely go that way, because to this point, video games have seemed like a fairly small hobby for only a certain section of the population, but I think that's because they've emerged relatively recently in human history, and in previous hobbies just don't have the ability to reach the level of complexity and grasp around the world. Like football, even though it has existed relatively recently in human history, just doesn't have the ability to entangle itself into your life quite as well as a video game. Because football has to be played in specific circumstances, right? You need a field outside. You need enough people to show up outside to do it, right? And you need them to agree on a time and date to do it. You can't just do football anytime, but you can do most video games anytime, anywhere. And the general cost to play video games is pennies on the hour. It's extremely easy to do, and we're making the means to do it cheaper every day, as well as more stimulating. And that's
those are good points.
Football today is the same as football 50 years ago, and it will probably be the same as it is 50 years from now. What might be the case is that virtual reality football will become bigger than real football, which would be interesting. But honestly, that would not surprise me given the direction of things.
Yeah, for thousands of years, I mean, the ancient Greeks considered physical games, gymnastics, and that sort of training to be an integral part of raising a healthy person to be a citizen. You know, it's just part of your education.
Mm-hmm.
There's a certain amount of game playing that's very good for us. I mean, I think video game playing included.
Yeah, and I think that's why we can't have the same fear about football, because it has its own properties, and the way it exists puts limits on it that keep it from becoming excessive. Now maybe football is not a good example because there's the concussion problem, the brain damage, and maybe we should.
But your point is well taken.
Maybe a less harmful sport to the body is one to focus on, but it offers some benefits, and there are sports that offer it as well, and to an extent, you can even say video games offer some benefits, but there's no property to video gaming that
it's not a self-limiting activity.
Right. So it's something that can easily get out of hand, and given that there are tyrannical forces that would be happy to exploit those properties, or corporate forces that would be willing to exploit those properties, and given how much resources they have at their disposal to take part in such exploitation, we do have to worry about those things. And then of course, there's the fact that if they're successful, immersion in these virtual environments and focus on virtual fictional problems distracts from the problems in the real world that exist. And so again, we talk about wasted potential. I mean, how do we solve the problem of climate change if we're all too focused on the virtual world and we're not worried about what's happening in the real world that's not being challenged or fixed?
Yeah, I don't want to overstate the problem. It won't help, but it's not likely to be the one thing that shoots us in the foot, right? But it's a possibility for sure.
Uh-huh.
And the interesting thing about a lot of the existential risks we've been talking about don't actually go away if we become a spacefaring civilization.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe climate change, if we have access to that much free energy from the sun, we definitely don't need fossil fuels in that case. But most of the others will probably continue to be an issue, right? We're probably still going to have rival states with nuclear weapons. I mean, it's unlikely to think that maybe we'll get away from it, but bioterrorism could still be a thing. But the SpaceX people talk a lot about this. They talk about starting a self-sufficient colony on Mars. That's their goal, right? And it's this idea of not having all our eggs in one basket and having bulkheads, water, firewalls.
Well, part of why climate change is an existential risk is because
we're all in one place, right?
Yeah, we have one climate. There's one climate that can go wrong and we're all dead. But if, or just nuclear annihilation, right? Our nuclear missiles can't reach Mars. They can reach the 7 continents, but they can't reach Mars. So if we get something to Mars that is self-sustaining, then things will go terribly on Earth, but at least there's still something on Mars. And then from there could be things on other planets.
And we're not totally safe once we get to Mars, but once we get out to, a few different stellar systems, I think, where you're 5 light years away, I think at that point we might really be safe. Then we might be like free and clear from all these.
We in a larger picture sense. Now there might be some conflicts that emerge. I would hope not by that level of advancement, but where certain amounts of destruction occur, but there'd be enough, I think, removal and enough abundance that with the way we're able to manipulate what's available in the universe to make the unlivable livable, that there'd be enough left over that after every conflict that we could continue forward.
Yeah. But we have to start working on it now, I think. Like, I just hope to see someday that NASA regains that sense of urgency it had back in the 60s, when we were just in an ego match with the Soviet Union, but we got amazing things done in a very short period of time. We can do it.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I think there is, we're coming up toward the end of our time here. I think I can really end things on a positive note. And I'm going to sort of bring up something I wrote again recently. And this was about the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. And I mentioned in this, and I'll say it here, that 100 years ago today, when these battered soldiers were emerging from the trenches, I doubt you could have imagined that Europe as it exists today is how they would have imagined that it ever looked, or that it would ever look. I mean, consider what it's almost completely democratic region of the world with a great deal of respect for human rights. And the majority of it is now unified politically in some sense. And even though Great Britain has decided to leave, more countries are trying to enter it than leave. So the overall net effect is still good. And you consider when World War I started, some parts of Europe were under the mercy of absolute monarchical systems. Some ethnic groups within the European continent did not have human rights. If you weren't German, Austrian, or Russian, or Hungarian, you were in a pretty bad position in much of Europe. And then if you were in the more liberal parts of Europe, if you weren't white, if you happened to live in Europe, it was bad for you. Those things are not really an issue anymore. Those social issues are gone, and then the political advancement is also just skyrocketed dramatically. I don't, we have people who are alive today who were born under absolute monarchies, who now live under free democratic societies that are cooperating with their European neighbors rather than competing. And I think that it seems amazing, but it's also consistent with just the exponential growth that has occurred among various things in humanity the last century. And I think we can perhaps surmise that a similar thing is going to occur globally within the next century. So I think if we do look at what some of the trends have been, if we look at how Europe has gone from being several divided states to kind of an EU, we can maybe look at the current world and maybe suppose that some form of global government will begin to form by the end of the century, and that it will be able to tackle a lot of the problems that we're facing. And so I think that's maybe one of the optimistic patterns we can apply to human development going forward. But I'll let you have the last word.
Well, we certainly do have a lot to be thankful for, don't we?
Yeah.
Given everything the world's been through, we're at this moment right now, and we're getting a taste of how good the future could be. I mean, I don't know about you, but living at this time in this place, among people like the ones I'm surrounded with, like no one's perfect, but this is amazing, and I hope this isn't the end. No,
I agree. All right. Well, this has been a very interesting discussion, and I thank you.
I enjoyed speaking with you, Joe.
Yeah, and I thank you for taking the time to come here again. If I hope the other people in the sub like it, and I feel like there's a good part 2 to this discussion that could be had someday.
Yeah, there are a bunch of things we didn't talk about, of course, right? We were making like a really high-level pass over a lot of topics, aren't we?
Oh yeah. All right, great. Well then, I'll catch you on the sub. I hope to see you posting and sharing your wisdom as people post those things, those crazy things sometimes. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Good night.
Thank you.